I'm going to go ahead and get started. I am Kristen Schilt. I'm the faculty director for the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality. And this is our annual Distinguished Faculty Lecture. It is named after our former colleague, Iris Marion Young, who was in political science and was one of the first faculty affiliates here until her untimely death. We invite faculty who embody the spirit of the kind of critical feminist inquiry that marks Iris Marion Young's work. So thank you for joining us. And just to note, we have two more of our big signature events this year. So on April 13th, we're going to have our first memorial lecture for Professor Lauren Berlant. And that will be memoirist Paul Lisicki will be talking about his work. And on May 8th, we're having our distinguished alumni lecture, and it will feature Professor Moon Duchin, who received a PhD in gender studies and mathematics here, rare combination, who does some really great work on redistricting and will be speaking with us on May 8th. So I look forward to seeing you all there. I'm so excited to introduce Professor Waldo Johnson, who is on the faculty at the Crown Family School of Social Work, Policy, and Practice, where he is also the Deputy Dean of Curriculum. I first had the opportunity to meet Waldo when I first got here as a professor, and my friend Mario Small was like, you should come to this party at my house because you're going to meet all the cool faculty. And I think that's where I met Waldo and Kathy Cohen, and I was like, oh, wow, this is great. And then I feel like I didn't see Waldo for many years after that, which is how this place works. Until we were recently on the search committee for the new university president that just happened, where we stupidly agreed to do this and then COVID happened. And so we spent basically a year of our life having Zoom meetings with the Board of Trustees at 7 a.m. on Saturdays. And it was really a bonding experience. One thing I really, I feel like we all got to know each other deeply in that process. And I so admire about Waldo being someone who can have this really intense research agenda that he'll be talking about today, but also take on all these institutional roles that, are doing the kind of work to get institutional change here, which is hard. And so I just want to say, in addition to the work at Crown, Waldo was the director of the Center for the Study of Race, Culture, and Politics in 2005. And if I'm not mistaken, was the person who hired Tracy Matthews, to which we are deeply grateful every day. So thank you, Waldo. Waldo is on our board for CSGS. And on top of that is now our vice provost, where he focuses on initiatives for diversity and inclusion and supporting faculty across their time here. So today he's going to be speaking to us on dismantling social justice. I'm sorry, no, we're not dismantling social justice, we're increasing social justice. So sorry, we're dismantling social distance and we're advancing social justice. So please join me in welcoming Professor Waldo Johnson.
I'm still thrown back by the fact that I might have to talk about dismantling social justice. That would be a real challenge for me, yes. But good afternoon. And indeed, it is a pleasure to be here. I want to begin by thanking the faculty director, Kristen Schilt, as well as the executive director of the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality, Gina Olson, for this very kind invitation. I also want to acknowledge, in addition to the leadership of the center, I also want to acknowledge the list of distinguished scholars who have stood in this symbolic space to deliver this lecture. I've had the pleasure on a couple of occasions to hear them, and even as I was preparing my presentation today, there were moments when my nerves just really got the best of me because I'm thinking about, I'm actually following Kathy Cohen and Deb Nelson and people, like that. So I want to also thank them for their individual as well as collective contributions toward making the Iris Marion Young Distinguished Faculty Lecture the important undertaking that it actually is today. This is having scholars, of the ilk of these individuals. It's a way of allowing those who did not have the pleasure to know or to meet her exactly what she stood for. I met Professor Young once, and it was a very brief encounter, just as I was joining the faculty here at the university. But as I broadened my research on urban Black males, I've begun to think a bit more about her scholarly focus on group differences as a contributing factor to inequality. And so in preparing today's lecture, I consider it a unique opportunity to join with you, not only to consider how her scholarship can be a lens for advancing the plight of urban Black males, but also how her scholarship might be instructive for advancing the university's diversity and inclusion goals, as well as faculty, student, and staff development. Professor Young's scholarship on social difference aids in our understanding of how a singular focus on individual rights and achievement often fails to advance group opportunities for similar outcomes. The University of Chicago is a premier educational institution recognized worldwide for the individual achievements of its students, faculty, and alumni who represent a pantheon of social identities. Yet, we are challenged in our institutional efforts to advance gender, racial, ethnic, geographical, religious, class diversity, and other social identities across faculty, staff, and students in dimensions that reflect our strong commitment to the same. Social difference thwarts diversity, and in this respect, Professor Young's scholarship on social difference reflects the university's high regard for advancing its leadership in this endeavor. One of the streams of my scholarship focuses on non-resident Black fathers. And in thinking and studying non-resident fatherhood among urban Black men and their families, I've sought to examine exactly what constitutes non-resident fatherhood and how economic and cultural responses to barriers that thwart father involvement among Black fathers and their families are racialized. Examining Black men as primary participants in the Great Migration positions me to examine Black fathers in parallel to paternal involvement activities to those who participated in the Industrial Revolution, who left their families to acquire support, but with a focus on the individual and environmental threats that these urban Black males encounter in service to their families. Black males represent a group for whom sustained opportunities for advancements have been thwarted since their arrival on American shores as chattel slaves. The urban environment is a context for examining Black males' health and well-being through historical, institutional, and intersectional lenses. The urban center became the destination and sanctuary where Black men ventured, often seeking refuge from the chains of chattel slavery, seeking economic and social advancement as freed men beginning in the late 19th century throughout the era of the post-Reconstruction and the era of the migration, which is generally agreed to be between 1915 and 1970. I focus primarily on the early years of the Great Migration and examining urban Black men's social identities and statuses, their lived experiences, and their health outcomes. The analysis problematizes the urban environment or urban context for Black males as a location of situational population density, distorted racial identities, and socioeconomic disparities that uniquely impact the health statuses of Black urban male dwellers across socioeconomic statuses. Today, the urban center continues to be a lure for enterprising young Black males, although advances in technology has dampened the need to work and reside in the city. Chicago, once the thriving metropolis of Black business, has steadily declined due to several factors, including inaccess to capital that weaken opportunities for business development, changes in commerce and technology advances, but also quality of life concerns, including declining high-quality public education options, housing shortages, and public safety. As a group, urban Black males, though, continue to move forward. So let me talk just a little bit about the period of the Great Migration, when many of these men left the rural South, coming north, Northeast, the Midwest, and others as a way of finding opportunities economically. The economic and social equity incentives for Black migration from the South to the urban destinations were plentiful and presumed beneficial across gender. However, they were not experienced as such. Throngs of Black men departed their southern locales in pursuit of improved work opportunities and to escape intense, racially charged, and grueling social conditions characterized by intimidation, fear, and subjugation that affected their health and well-being status. Rarely did young and old, able-bodied, and dependent parent and child migrate together. It was too expensive. Young men between 18 and 35 years old who had worked as unskilled industrial laborers were usually the first to go, presumed better prepared to endure the long trek and physical transition to the cities. Many were married and had children, often departed their families and respective origins with little or no money, and were unprepared for the long, grueling relocation experience. They confronted segregated waiting rooms, buses, and train coaches, as well as unfamiliar procedures and unfriendly conductors. Limited amenities were accessible or affordable. They expected to reunite with their families as soon as they had made their way. Getting to the promised land did not come cheap. So many migrants made the journey in stages, stopping off and working places in the South, then continuing their way. The so-called step migration takes a very long time, which lengthened their pilgrimage to the promised land. Black men dutifully enacting their instrumental and expected family and self-sufficiency roles in search of reward were more likely to become migrants. The urban environment was both an enticing destination and, upon arrival, a contested space for Black men. Their reception to the promised land, so-called places of economic opportunity, but namely the urban industrial centers in the Midwest heartland, the Northeastern corridor, and the California West Coast, was anything but welcoming. Upon arrival, to their destinations, these men encountered frustration and difficulty finding lodging or shelter, as well as difficulty in finding work. In short, the transition to the urban environment induced economic and resettlement stressors for Black men participating in the cross-country pilgrimage in search of better opportunities, impacting their health, as well as indirectly impacting their family's psychological well-being back in the South. As young migrants, generally, these Black men were presumed physically fit to prevail over the physical challenges of migration, although many were unfamiliar with the extended travel, financially unprepared to assume the associated expenses, and psychologically unprepared to begin life in a new environment, unlike the points of departure, without the companionship and support of family and friends. These challenges during transit and urban transition, along with urban stressors they encountered upon arrival, likely enfeebled their resolve and weakened their well-being. As new residents, these recent Black male migrants were forced to deal with poor working conditions and competition for adequate domiciles, as well as widespread racism and prejudice. Faced with these challenges, Black migrants began to build a new place for themselves in public life, actively confronting economic, political, and social challenges and creating a new Black urban culture that would exert enormous influence in the decades to come. However, subsequent historical and social science scholarship document that the devastating psychological effects and impaired well-being statuses resulting from social exclusion while building an urban culture. Even as the early Black male migrants in the urban centers like Chicago settled in, the urban environments they routinely navigated differed greatly from the evolving urban environment which the captains of industry and their families resided and enjoyed. These Black environments were largely racially segregated and even differed greatly in housing stock conditions and access to neighborhood resources from those occupied by immigrant workers performing the same job task, but receiving differential wages. The enthusiasm they shared collectively as they departed their Southern locations immediately morphed into frustration and disappointment, including inducing vulnerability without the support of family, friends, and social institutions they left behind. They improved, but less than optimal economic opportunities, in addition to the dire social conditions they experience, resulting in compound stress, which affect their mental health statuses. The urban environment posed a new economic and legal challenge for Black men's health statuses. Their urban resettlement induced separation anxiety, loneliness, and depression that posed psychological and behavioral challenges to their health statuses. As a result of being physically separated from family households, extended family that previously resided in proximity, neighbors, familiar landscape, and recreational and social settings, these men lost such personal connections in exchange for their desolate urban experiences to which they were often economically and legally confined. Among relocating Southern Black men during the Great Migration, the transition to becoming the urban pioneer often exerted more tension and stress on their health than had been recognized or acknowledged. The physical and psychological toll of these migratory experiences might suggest that these oppressive travel experiences would prepare these Black men for what was waiting for them once they reached their urban destinations. The ambiguous physical and psychological losses they endured during their travel were painful, but male bravado often prevented them from expressing their true emotions. Their romanticized notions about their urban destinations as the promised land often led many to believe that economic advancement would prevail, yielding social uplift, and that their current in-transit travails were temporary. In fact, some immigrants died in transit, and even more died due to truncated life course experiences in the urban cities. Over time, empirical studies have affirmed and expanded the nation's understanding of health risk generally associated with urban living, including the differences in sectorial labor, residential physical environments and conditions, racial discrimination, and violence affect health outcomes within urban areas. Today, more than half of the world's population lives in urban areas. Chronic exposure to urban stressors, including crime and violence, has been linked to increased aggression, anxiety, poor academic performance, delinquency, and social withdrawal. Combined with employment discrimination, redlining, and housing instability, urban Black males have experienced multiple stressors that have impacted their health status and well-being. The very presence of these Black men, given their historical, racial, socioeconomic, and social statuses, has posed challenges to their functioning and well-being within the urban environment. The shift in focus from urban Black men during the Great Migration to Black males in the contemporary context, which include boys and adolescents and young adult males, reflect the vulnerable and diminishing well-being statuses of urban Black males across the developmental life course. Urban young Black males' vulnerable well-being statuses are due in part to their gendered risk-taking orientations and behaviors, which are widely present across racial, ethnic, and class divides. Our Chicago colleague, Margaret Spencer, would add that their vulnerable well-being statuses are context-driven and enhanced by socially constructed masculinity. Their vulnerable statuses are also the result of differential and discretionary responses and treatment of urban Black boys, adolescents, and adult males to their gendered and context-driven behavior as exercised by public authority figures, including educators, law enforcement, juvenile and criminal magistrates, who routinely view them as disposable threats to civil society and order. The COVID-19 pandemic created stress and threats to life of the world population. Similarly, the American public media reported that COVID-19 mortality rate by race and ethnicity through July 2020, including Washington, D.C. and 45 states. These data, while showing an alarming rate for all races, demonstrate how minorities are hit harder and how among minority groups, Black American population in many states bear the brunt of the pandemic's health impact. Along with the pandemic, increasing calls for eradicating anti-Black and racial justice heightened following the death of unarmed victims Ahmaud Arbery on February 23rd, 2020 in Brunswick, Georgia, Breonna Taylor on March 13th, 2020 in Louisville, Kentucky, and subsequently George Floyd on May 25th, 2020 in Minneapolis, Minnesota. These deaths became emblematic worldwide for a call to justice. With respect to healthcare access for urban Black males, current social work and public health literature suggests that the proximity and access to health providers and services in urban landscapes vary by race and place. The lack of access to health and social services for vulnerable Black men, examined via the lenses of population density, gender, racial identities, and socioeconomic status, may shape observed and enduring health disparities. Additionally, living in urban contexts for many poor men, but especially Black men, often entails navigating a myriad of environmental and social circumstances and pathways that disproportionately impact and diminish their health status. Prior to and during the Great Migration, healthcare access for Black Americans had been sorely limited in the segregated Southern United States. Policies described as deluxe Jim Crow aided in expanding racially segregated healthcare to disenfranchise Black Southern Americans. However, access to doctors and medical personnel was not readily available, due in part to racial segregation. In migration cities, the newly arrived Black male workers experienced similar healthcare access challenges. They were relegated to living in racially segregated neighborhoods that often lacked supportive health and social services. The Black professional class, of which lawyers, bankers, physicians, and nurses were included, were slowly evolving and establishing practices within the neighborhoods, but to do so often required financial resources beyond what their medical education and training as practitioners would immediately yield within their neighborhoods. The new urban dwellers often continued to practice their Southern-rooted cultural health practices and, when available, sought support from urban church outreach efforts and civic organizations to augment their health needs. Other supportive professional services like social work were also slowly evolving, but at an even more gradual pace. However, social work endeavors within cities like Chicago were far from inclusive in service provision for all urban residents. For example, Jane Addams' work with recent European immigrants in Chicago in the early 20th century is widely recognized as the first of the nationally organized social work community endeavors. But this endeavor did not include recent Black migrants. Ida B. Wells, a recognized Black journalist and anti-lynching advocate, founded the Negro Fellowship League and helped to open settlement houses for Black immigrants arriving in Chicago. She founded a settlement house for Black men, supporting them with complimentary meals, transitional housing, and social services during the transition to urban life. The massive influx of newcomers often overwhelmed city resources. Jobs may have been there for the taking, but already inadequate housing, healthcare, schools, and other services available to Black Americans were quickly overwhelmed. To be sure, enduring social and health inequities, as well as discriminatory institutional conditions and practices, frame the daily experiences of these urban Black men. Collectively, the lack of opportunity, capabilities, security, empowerment, and a health supporting physical living environment as experienced by Black men in the urban environment can affect health status broadly. Black men's desire for economic equity and social equality were prime reasons for their large-scale migration to from the largely rural southern United States to the urban centers of commerce in the Midwest, East and West during the migration period. However, upon their arrival as urban residents, the Black male migrants also encountered racial bias and discrimination in job opportunity, residential options, and public accommodations, but couched differently. Jim Crow laws and practices that permeated virtually every aspect of their lives in the Southern residents were replaced by de jure but less apparent racial practices in urban settings. The urban locales were not sanctuaries that provided Black men safety and security from economic risk and violence. Urban areas were suffused with the various forms of economic risk. And as new residents unfamiliar with the nuances of urban life, Black males were vulnerable targets. In addition to urban Black residents, in addition, as urban Black residents prospered in business and professional endeavors, prominent Black men could become racial targets because of their success. For example, angry whites started a race riot in Tulsa, Oklahoma, that destroyed a thriving Black business community. However, race riots not only occurred in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, but earlier in East St. Louis, Illinois, Houston, Texas in 1917. The Red Summer of 1919 saw race riots in Chicago and Washington, D.C. As the Black population increased in urban areas, so did the proportion of Black inmates in urban jails, parallel to the racial demographics of the chain gangs and prisons in the Southern United States. Collectively, these dimensions of civil insecurity and social inequality heightened and contributed to the declining possibilities for Black male status in urban areas, and as a result, the decline of Black men's health status. In contrast to receiving and celebrating their anticipated gains and rewards of hard work, migrant Black males often experience racial indignities like those they fled in the Southern United States, while learning to navigate new, more nuanced racial assaults within the unfamiliar urban environment. These interconnected experiences affected their health statuses. The fear of racial retaliation for building successful business enterprises, such as what Black businesses owners in Tulsa, Oklahoma experienced in 1921, produced anxiety and stress, even before the race riot. Tulsa Black business owners were concerned about whether Black consumers would remain loyal customers or be lured away by powerful white merchants or political leaders who feared Black economic progress. Even providing niche services in the trades, as Booker T. Washington advocated, did not shield prospective Black entrepreneurs from white anger and racial backlash. Although racial segregation provided a racial niche market for exclusive access to Black clients for services like banking, laundry, and cleaning, mortuary, and small and large appliance repair in Chicago and Washington, D.C. As with Jim Crow practices in the South, the Black customer could easily be siphoned off or diverted away with retaliatory threats and practices leveled against Black business owners by shrewd white competitors who set up competing businesses in Black neighborhoods. Thus, Black business owners needed to not only focus on expanding their niche market, but also continuously work to maintain their customer bases. Over time, as the number of businesses grew, Black business owners banded together and founded mutual support organizations to address common concerns facing their enterprises. With respect to racial segregation, when Black men arrived in their respective urban destinations during the Great Migration, they were restricted in their options for residential neighborhoods. They quickly recognized that some of the racial policies and Jim Crow practices that governed their lives in the South were also in play in the Promised Land. These Black men often resided in stark housing within racially segregated neighborhoods, like the deplorable housing and residential conditions in which European immigrants working in the Chicago stockyard resided, as reported by Upton Sinclair in The Jungle. These neighborhoods offered limited to no commercial services, such as food markets or retail stores for purchasing quality goods and services. If so, limited competition among commercial business often resulted in higher pricing for basic goods and services, akin to the onerous business exchange experiences as sharecroppers or farmhands, in which they engaged in low-wage, unskilled labor with local businessmen in the South, where their monthly bills for credit often exceeded their earnings. The initial wave of Black migrants to Chicago, for example, were relegated to the tenements and boarding houses that would become the Bronzeville neighborhood. As urban neighborhoods like Bronzeville grew incrementally to accommodate the expanding Black population arriving to these urban cities, the growth of the neighborhoods was unplanned and often lacked competitive commercial infrastructure, along with needed public and social services for a largely rural, urban transitioning population for whom access to needed or comparable services in either nearby or distal neighborhoods were unavailable. Discriminatory housing and racially biased public accommodation laws and practices constrain access to residential choices, resulting in racially segregated options, often unaccompanied by neighborhood services. As new residents largely unfamiliar with the urban space, Black men were also constrained in their neighborhood dietary options, potentially contributing to the risk of compromised health status. Their limited mobility was further constrained by public transportation options and infrastructure, which resulted in limited access to quality institutional health and medical care services. Being routinely forced to travel outside the neighborhoods for access to health services has likely contributed to Black men's demographic profile as resisting to engaging in healthcare system and as having poor health-seeking behaviors. In addition, traveling outside the neighborhood boundaries in search of others' consumer options or to augment those not available within the neighborhood possibly induced anxiety and depression, and in some instances placed them at risk of physical harm. Black men's health outcomes within urban areas mandate that appropriate attention is given to eliminating poverty and income inequality. Some contend that poverty is not only a question of money, but it has 4 other dimensions: lack of opportunities for employment and access to productive resources, lack of capabilities, access to education, health, and other public services, lack of security, the vulnerability to economic risk and violence, and lack of empowerment, absence of voice, power, and participation. Authors also propose a fifth dimension, the lack of health supporting physical living environment. Interventions at the higher poverty level will lead to create more sustainable and equitable living conditions and environments for all urban residents, but particularly the economically vulnerable residents, including those in cities where policies for health take into account every sector of the city. Spatial analysis is one of the new tools being applied to attempts to qualify the relationship between health disparities and the built environment. One spatial analysis tool, GIS, has long been used in other areas such as city planning, demography, and epidemiology, but is now allowing environmental and public researchers to characterize local environments at finely resolved geographical scales. Community-based participatory research studies engage residents and other stakeholders within the community being studied as a means of collaborating and gathering and disseminating of scientific knowledge about the interrelationships between the physical and social environments and health. Health equity implies policies and actions that improve the urban environment. For instance, limiting greenhouse gas emissions. Determinants of health equity in urban settings include a wide range of factors in politics and economics. The physical and natural and human-made aspects of cities contribute to health. The social environment or social and personal characteristics of the urban population round out the considerations for achieving health equity. Deficiencies in any of these can lead to health inequities and greater health risk for minorities, women, migrants, the poor, the elderly, children, disabled persons, and other vulnerable groups. Interventions to improve health equity through the environment include actions and policies that deal with proximal risk factors in deprived urban areas, such as safe drinking water supply, reduced air pollution from household cooking and heating, as well as from vehicles and industry, reduce traffic injury hazards and noise, improved working environment, and reduce heat stress because of global climate change. Progressive taxes also could be used to level the playing field for those who have been historically disadvantaged from competing fairly with others, reflect not only a financial investment in improving the health and well-being of urban Black men, but also a commitment towards social justice. The life course experiences of urban Black males in the United States are unique and consistent across their duration as US citizens. Urban Black males fare worse on virtually every dimension of well-being when compared to their racial and ethnic peers. Their health status, given their traumatic life course experiences though largely undiagnosed, is widely recognized as compromised. Professor Young's social difference theory aptly describes how the failure to move beyond individual to group differences can affect the outcome of many disadvantaged in society. Throughout their presence in urban settings, Black men have faced economic and social challenges. While the current political and social mood of the country is unsettling and not promising based on political will for uplifting the status of urban Black men, it arrives on the heels of a more recent political and social era in which a national conversation, some reckoning, and limited gains emerged to improve the status of Black males in America. These activities to date form the basis of a sustained push to improve the health and well-being of urban Black men. Economic and social investments in these men will go toward enhancing their health statuses. The growth and expansion of the initiative within communities affirm the attraction of urban settings for population-based intervention initiatives. Unfortunately, none of the 6 milestones, for example, in the My Brother's Keeper initiative, and those 6 milestones include getting a healthy start and entering school ready to learn, reading at a grade level by 3rd grade, graduating from high school ready for college and career, completing post-secondary education and training, successfully entering the workforce, and finally keeping kids on track and giving them second chances. Neither addresses health issues. Yet, access to healthcare, reproductive healthcare in particular, is essential for achieving the 6 milestones. Health is a prerequisite for ensuring that urban Black men gain a good foothold on the ladder to success. The current system of providing reproductive health information and services, however, works against some of the young people who need the services the most. Although publicly subsidized sexual and reproductive health exists in many communities, it is still disproportionately directed toward women. Most men ages 15 to 44 need family planning services, but less than 19% receive health care that includes contraceptive advice or counseling about sexually transmitted infections. Among the urban stressors that challenge urban Black men's well-being and place them at risk of poverty and disadvantage as individuals and family providers or educational inequalities, neighborhood effects, workplace discrimination, parenting issues, lack of access to credit, and rates of incarceration. Relationships exist among these attributing factors. For example, educational inequalities contribute to higher rates of school truancy and dropout, which increase idleness and unemployment among young males within neighborhoods, which potentially triggers upticks in criminal activity as alternative labor and economic strategies, and subsequently escalated rates of police surveillance, juvenile justice involvement, and juvenile detention and incarceration. The concentration effects due to the population density and proximity to others so burdened in urban settings yield an unwieldy condition for effectively addressing male poverty solely because of its scope, dimensions, and interrelationships. Whether situated in the urban core, rural landscape, or suburban enclaves, environmental threats to health and well-being of urban Black men persist. Urban Black males face numerous social, racial, and gender challenges en route from boyhood throughout adulthood, and concentration effects of the urban environment when urban Black male development can intensify the frequency and impact of such experiences. The University of Chicago is replete with examples of Black males of stellar achievement, particularly if we look at the early years of the university. Among its alumni, historian Carter G. Woodson, the founder of Black History Month and the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. Marine biologist Ernest E. Just, longtime researcher at the Marine Biological Laboratory in Woods Hole, Massachusetts. The first Black law school graduates, Nelson Willis, who graduated with a Bachelor of Laws degree in 1919, and Earl B. Dickerson, the first Black to earn a JD at the University of Chicago Law School in 1920. Sociologist Franklin Frazier, who became the national president of the National Association of Social Workers. Anthropologist Allison Davis, who was also invited to join the faculty and in 1947 became the first Black professor at a major white university, tenured. He joined the faculty along with John Hope Franklin, historian, biologist James Bowman, sociologist Edgar Epps, German language professor James Bruce, economist Abram Harris, and English scholar George Kent. And still, these names and their accomplishments remain largely unsung when we think about the potential of investing in urban Black males. While my Black male faculty and university staff colleagues are visible, though small, our presence alone fails to illuminate the potential of possibilities among urban Black males. Thank you.
Fantastic. We'll open the floor for a few questions and we hope you'll join us for a reception.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Jonathan Boyden. First of all, thank you for the presentation and for all of the work that you have done, specifically regarding Black men and non-residing Black people. So thank you. My question is, provided the unique social context, psychologically, environmentally, uniquely to Black men, in context of transgenerational trauma, all of those things in mind, what do you propose as an effective intervention for restoring the esteem and psychological health of urban Black people?
You could not have posed a more difficult question. That's okay. So I'll start. First of all, I think we cannot start with thinking about how we help men, that we have to really start with boys. And we have to, with Black boys, because early in boyhood, we began to see differences in terms of academic engagement, often achievement, and while we can celebrate those that do very well, and they often become the poster boys, so to speak, for someone who's doing something well, that's not how the majority of the population is in terms of boys are experiencing the world. And in many instances, experiencing educational settings, and so if in fact we can think a bit more about how it is that we can best engage that population. And I think in some respects, we're not talking about something that is uniquely about Black boys. That this is a phenomena that is perhaps a problem across race and ethnicity. It shows up and perhaps may be more concentrated among this particular population. But a part of the reason why we see it in that respect is, for example, in a place like Chicago, we have hyper segregation, in schools and in the settings. So the ways in which they are presented to us can easily cause us to kind of believe that, this is a group that's beyond, any kind of help. But even as I advocate for kind of starting with boys and thinking about what boys can be, I was, over the weekend at a social work research conference, and I was asked, I was serving on a panel talking about, promotion to and tenure and promotion to professor and things of that sort. And I said, I often think that when we think about that as an individual kind of exercise, we've missed the entire boat, because promotion with tenure or to full professor is as much of an institutional commitment to something as it is the individual. And it requires that you be in sync, in alignment. And so all the way back to recruiting people to become faculty members, there ought to be ways in which we can, as they are coming in the door, if we're making decisions, that we need to be able to see them as tenure. We need to be able to see them as full professors and stuff. And so we should, as best we can do, have the kinds of markers that allow us to kind of say, at this particular stage, this person looks promising. And that's ideally, what we do. We can't always predict with 100% certainty, but that's the case. And I think the same thing has to be the case for thinking about working with boys of color, and particularly African-American boys or Black boys, that we have to think about them as possibilities and not necessarily kind of think about them in terms of all of the ways in which we find them offensive or undesirable and stuff, because there are ways in which then we fail to continue to invest. But at the same time, as we're kind of investing in boys, we can't just ignore the men, because we can't throw away a generation in anticipation that maybe the next generation will be more ideal. So we have to also think about, are there various kinds of reparative things that we can do, to help those who might be further along and require more. Perhaps we have different kinds of expectations in terms of what we will be able to deliver there. But ideally, what it should also do is help us to kind of understand the importance of investing early with boys, because it is there's fairly good research that suggests that, trying to make adjustments, once they become adults or they reach a certain point, the likelihood of success is minimal. Yes.
Interested in how to advance like services and mental health services. There's a lot of attention right now about social work still being a predominant white profession. And I think if you look at like social work schools like here in Chicago and around the country, the student body is still predominantly white. You have like, and you have like interventions that would help kind of address some of these shortcomings and why aren't social work that are allegedly trying to advance social justice already adopting them?
Well, I think there are a variety of things that, contribute to the challenge. I think that schools have to think about where the best possibilities of recruiting those students are. And there are a number of historically Black colleges and universities, or we refer to them HBCUs, or Hispanic serving institutions, or other minority serving institutions, where those schools also, produce high quality scholars. If we only recruit in the places that are very much like us, then we are battling for a handful of students. But there can be ways in which we could expand our recruitment pool. But I also think that we have to recognize that a lot of people coming out of college, or even going to college, or either thinking themselves or being encouraged by family members. And I find this to be particularly the case for a number of first-generation college students, where people expect you to go into some area where there is the opportunity to earn money, to be able sometimes to now take your rightful place in terms of helping other people in the family go to school and things of that sort. And there can be, instances where people may have an interest in social work, but it might be a bit harder for them to kind of make that commitment when in fact there may be other things that might be more appealing and may yield better kind of opportunities in the labor market and stuff. And so I think that in addition to thinking about the ways in which those students that you are successful in recruiting to come to schools like Crown and stuff, and let's face it, the price is often a deterrent. I want to believe that we produce a great social worker, but it's expensive, and so how the degree to which the school can come up with more opportunities, financial support that allow for people to feel comfortable in terms of making a decision like that, such that they're not going to complete a 2-year program in social work and perhaps have more debt than they might earn in their first year of working, is also a challenge. Ideally, we'd like to maybe at some point have a national program where social workers, like professionals in some other fields, could have some debt release or a payback program that will allow them to make conscious decisions about going into social work. A lot of people do it later. We see more people who are a bit older that have done some other things doing it, but it's not as, in some instances, not as easy to for students coming right out of college to make the decision that that's exactly what they're going to do. Yes.
Thank you so much for the talk. As you were talking through the history and then some of the different factors like empowerment, I couldn't help in the back of my mind think of the mayoral races that are going on. And particularly for black male empowerment, Chicago historically is innovative both at the community programming level, through the Panthers, and then probably reaching political zenith of the city of Harold, Washington. But that's going on 40 years now.
Right.
With your historical wisdom, what lessons can we learn to see if we can recreate some of that political empowerment?
Wow.
Not gonna outdo my friend.
Right now, but I'm just reminded that I'm at the University of Chicago. But I do appreciate the questions. And I think that that will be a difficult thing to recreate because where we were in 1982, we're not there, anymore. Not to say that we can't improve the plight beyond where it is at this particular point. But, if you've been paying attention, with respect to kind of thinking about the demographics of Chicago, Black people are leaving Chicago en masse these days. Kathy Cohen's, research focused on the Black Youth Project a few years ago kind of indicated that a lot of Black youth or young people in Chicago are leaving after they sometimes graduate from high school, but college, they're thinking about opportunities elsewhere. Sometimes they just want to get out of the cold weather, but I think increasingly it's the violence that is driving people, away. And so, as the numbers, decrease, then the ability, that was the point. If you read Natalie Moore's The South Side, she talks about in her book that at the point when she wrote that book, that the population of Chicago was about 1/3 white, 1/3 Black, 1/3 Latinx. So it was fairly evenly divided. I don't think that that's the case anymore. And so while I do think, there could be a strong candidate, that might be, African-American. One of the things that occurred when Harold Washington ran, there were not 5 or 6 other Black people in the race, that everybody kind of united around Harold Washington. And Harold Washington made the point of saying, if you get so many people registered, then I'll run. And so, and I think that might have been a bit tongue in cheek. He might have thought that maybe they wouldn't do it, and then they did. But he did. But that was a way of kind of saying, I'll be committed to you if you show some commitment to me. Now, I think it's, and I'm not advocating that there can only be one person running. I want to be very clear about that. But there are different kinds of challenges and outcomes that you have to think about when you have a race like you do right now, where I believe there are 9 people in the race. And there's just going to be very difficult to rally around, any one person that might recreate what Washington, was able to do back in 83.
We'll take one more question and then we'll have, please.
I'm sorry.
No,
I'm sorry. I was going to follow up on that by saying, do you think that that's an issue in some of the other phenomena that we're seeing and some of the other obstacles in terms of political movements, social movements, the campaigns that we might have seen in the past and want to recreate, where it may be easier or more realistic to rally support or unified support if people feel and perceive their options to be limited. So is it possible that part of what we suffer from is that we see appearance that we either have all of these other choices or that we should have all of these other choices? And that also, and now my mind is going to things like when we see people, there's no perfect candidate for people to be like, wow, y'all looking at the candidate, but why did I go with the third one who doesn't represent this particular thing that I want to see. So with some of the, if you think about the macro multipliers.
Yeah. I think, yeah, I do. And I think that the whole notion of civic education is something that really needs to be revisited, you know, in many ways in communities, not just in the Black community, but across. You know, a lot of people really just don't have the interest or the will in terms of it. But those are individuals, maybe they're not the ones that are crying, but they do then have kind of knee-jerk responses when in fact an elected official does something or fail to do something, you know, that they want. And so I think it is kind of important that that we figure out ways how we can bring that back. So in my thinking, you know, many of the calls now about how do we rebuild democracy? How do we do that? I view civic education as being a big part of that. And I think without that, it's not likely that, you know, we're going to get very far. Just one person had the hand up at the same time. Go ahead.
Oh, I just had a question kind of across your research and your varying interests. Where do you see this, or if you see this kind of trend around men needing to work, and like if that is this like barrier to other kind of opportunities? So even when you're talking about the Great Migration, like I imagine it would be sent up here so we could like build an economic stability and go out and work and you know, maybe bring families up, maybe support other families. Like how does that kind of very gendered lens on like you need to get to making money as soon as possible potentially, you know, if at all, also intersect with some of these outcomes and things.
Yeah, so that one is not a hard question, but that's a whole nother discussion. But the short version of that is, you know, I think that again, we're in a totally different, you know, environment, and because my work focuses on males, urban Black males, I do not in any way want to suggest that with respect to the migration that it was only men going. There were these gender differences in that it wasn't as easy for females, you know, to do it, but there were a number of women who also, you know, left and moved north as well. And so, but we're now, you know, in a time where, you know, the responsibilities around work and supporting family, you know, ought to be far less gender than it is, particularly for well, I think across the board, you know, quite honestly, but I think particularly for families in marginal and lower incomes, and maybe even, you know, what might be called the working class. You know, so the notion that only men are providers, and this is something that I've often, you know, stressed, that within Black families, historically, while there may have been like some perception that there was a head of household, you know I grew up in a household where both parents worked, and you know, it was very interesting for me. I didn't really stop to think about the fact that I grew up in a two-parent household where both parents work, because I think I just kind of went along with the notion that my dad was the head of household. But then when I think back to it, my mother paid all the bills. You know, she was the person who managed, you know, everything, and her income was not just her frill kind of stuff. It was a part of the household income. And when she lost her job, she was an educator, and she decided, I had cousins, older cousins, who were very involved in the civil rights movement, and she decided to march. She lost her job, and she couldn't get a teaching job in the like 7-county area. The word was out that she had been a part of this, and it was her. She decided at that point she'd have to go back to school and get more education. So she went back and ultimately got her doctorate and then started teaching at the college level. But it was not, like I say, it was a part of the household income. And what I noticed even in my research around father involvement with a lot of even low income households, there often are situations where the men, even if they can get jobs, the jobs would be seasonal. And so they may not be able to sustain the family for the entire year. So it often might be the case that even if the mother in the household was not working full time, she might have to offset the loss of family income during the periods of time when he couldn't get a job, particularly if he was doing work that was outside, where the seasons might impact that. And so I think this notion about who's the head of household, who pays this. I mean, I think a lot of families now are just kind of really struggling because of the tightness of the wages and things of that sort. So I don't know if that's something that we'd want to go down. If that's clearly there's still people who kind of think in that way, but I don't know if that's a very reasonable way to kind of think about it. Okay. Thank you again very much.